Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. I'm your host, Dr. Pavini Moray, and today it's an honor and a privilege to introduce you to Darcy Ottey. Darcy has been dedicated to creating intentional rites of passage experiences for young people since her nature-based coming-of-age experience when she was 13. She's grateful to her teachers and mentors in this work, including Stan Crow, Gigi Coyle, Melissa Michaels, Elder Paul Hill, and many more. Darcy's ancestors include early Quaker settlers of Turtle Island from Wales and England, British coal miners, and Ukrainian peasants. Currently co-director of Youth Passageways, Darcy has worked with a variety of youth-serving organizations as both rite of passage practitioner and administrator, as well as a consultant and educator on themes of social justice, ancestral recovery, and rites of passage. And she holds a master's degree in environment and community from Antioch University in Seattle. And her passions are dancing, especially under the full moon, making folk dolls, helping herself and others with racial, gender, and class privilege, understand our history, reclaim ancestral traditions, and take responsibility for addressing injustices that they have perpetuated. And you can find out more about Darcy at youthpassageways.org. So Darcy, welcome to Bespoken Bones.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So I guess I'd first like to just ask you, initiation and rites of passage, are those synonyms or are they different, or how do you hold that?
Yeah, so I think that lots of people would say different things about this in the scholarly research and in practice as well. And the way that I would describe it, my understanding of it is that initiation is a type of rite of passage, but there are other types as well. So initiation is a passage into a specific social status. And a rite of passage can also encompass a birth or a death or any transition from one state of being to another. So it's more of a broader term.
Got it. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So initiation is kind of under the umbrella of rite of passage, but is specific to once you move through an initiation, you get access to different levels of social capital or different levels of religious teachings. I think that's what I'm understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely how I perceive it as well. And I think one of the things that I often reflect on and am curious about is I think that there's many things that I would consider to be rites of passage, or that we at Youth Passageways consider to be rites of passage, and that's not language that the folks who are engaged in that work do. And so, the term rite of passage comes specifically out of the field of anthropology. And so it's kind of it's an anthropological term. No one in a traditional society engaged in an activity would describe it as a rite of passage. They would talk about the specific ceremony or cultural form. And rite of passage is more of an academic umbrella of that.
Thank you. And so what's the difference, if a birth is a rite of passage? I mean, it sounds like some people hold it more in this, not that they're thinking, right, I'm just thinking about when I had kids, I wasn't oh, I'm going through a rite of passage, but I knew that something really big was happening, right? But I imagine that there's people who you still go through a birth or something or a death, but they don't necessarily hold it with the same framework. And I'm just wondering if you notice anything about what makes it specifically a big deal to some people, how, or is there a specific language that they're using around it? Or is there a specific framing that they're doing? What makes it a rite of passage?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, kind of specific like conditions for a rite of passage, the way I talk about it is that it's intentional and meaningful. And so intentional meaning that there is some level of awareness of what's happening and a choice that's happening. Meaningful in the sense that both for the individual, that they feel like it's a significant transition and important, and also that there is community witnessing and celebration and support of that as well. So that it's significant for both the person and the community, to me, is a really important criteria. And I would juxtapose that, like the language that I have often used around that is the difference between a like holistic rite of passage and maybe a fragmented rite of passage, where there is a significant transition, maybe like a trauma experience that someone has where things are really fundamentally different for them on the other side. But there hasn't been the same level of community holding, of safety, of choice, of intentionality for the person. And so there's cleanup work that needs to be done in order to really harvest the learnings from that.
I'm imagining, you work mostly with youth rites of passage, but, rites of passage happen at various points in all of our lives. And some of them are formal, and some of them are intentionful and meaningful and have community witness. And some of them are, I'm just remembering when I was 13, I grew up Methodist, and I went through whatever that is. Like, it's whatever that welcoming it is into the church, where you go through a year of training, and then you make a decision about if you're going to make a spiritual commitment to that faith tradition or not. And I did, and it was meaningful, and it was intentionful. And, but at the same time, like when I think back to some of the other rites of passage, like my first cigarette, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, like the first time I had a drink with a friend or snuck out of my house, like the first time I kissed someone, like those were also deeply meaningful, maybe not so intentional. I don't know. They were pretty on purpose. And so I'm just curious of like, it sounds like there's more formalized rites of passage, and then there's more like individualized or personalized, or I don't know, different, some other level. Am I getting it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think another kind of way that I would describe it is, for me, those are specific markers on a path of initiation, versus necessarily like a full rite of passage themselves. And so, one of the common frameworks used in rites of passage, which again comes out of the field of anthropology, and it's, I would say, kind of, it's a superimposed frame that's Eurocentric, that's male biased. And so those caveats on it, and it's a very like basic, training wheels for rites of passage is the way I describe it, is this kind of 3-part frame of the phases of a rite of passage that come out of the work of Arnold van Gennep, who was the researcher who coined the term rites of passage. And what he talked about in his research was that, and many rite of passage programs and offerings, experiences today are kind of built on this frame of the first phase of severance. So the letting go of the old identity and kind of cutting yourself off from the person that you were before. What's often, the second stage is often described as threshold or liminality. Liminality was the term that Van Gennep used. And this like in between time where you're not one thing and you're not another, you kind of have no status. You're in this no status time. And then incorporation, from the Latin root corpus or body. So bringing into the body and actually embodying in the world this new identity, this new status. And so when you share your story of like these different markers, I would sort of understand those in my own mind as kind of markers along that path of initiation into adulthood, where you were either kind of actively leaving childhood behind and using these cues as like, I'm done with my child self, or you were in this in-between time and like exploring who you are now and what the new identity is that you're going to assume.
Yeah, it's good. I want to read a little bit from Of Water and the Spirit. I'm sure you've read that book, by Malidoma Somé.
Mm-hmm.
And he writes, when a child grows into an adolescent, he or she must be initiated into adulthood. A person who doesn't get initiated will remain an adolescent for the rest of their life, and this is a frightening, dangerous, and unnatural situation. After initiation, the elders will pick a partner for the young person, someone who's selected for their ability to team up with you in the fulfillment of your life purpose. If one obediently walks their life path, they will become an elder somewhere in their late 40s or early 50s. Graduating to this new status, however, depends on one's good track record. Yeah, just curious if that kind of fits into this framework that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a beautiful quote. And there's a couple of things that stand out to me about that. One is this idea of, what he's talking about there is similar. The phrase that Stephen Jenkinson uses is killing the child. And that there is this actually very clear marker that needs to happen. And this is the idea of severance, of there is no going back. That former self is no longer available. And again, in a healthy culture, that is done, by elders, by uncles, and aunties and older relatives in a way that are aware of the young person's needs, that the young person has been set up and has the skills to go through what is, generally a fairly significant trauma, but they're supported in that and held in that. And it's very clear and for a very specific reason in the community. But yeah, there is no going back. And I think what the Malidoma Somé quote is very, clear and specific about that. I think the other piece that it really speaks to is this, the obediently walking, if a person has obediently walked their path, and the challenge, of course, for those of us, growing up in a fragmented culture where obediently following the culture actually doesn't lead us towards adulthood. It leads us towards this chronic liminal adolescence of being focused on our own needs and, where consumption is valued over, contributing in a meaningful way towards life on this planet.
Yeah, I remember I read that book many, many years ago, and I was so struck by the piece about that some people don't make it through. The initiation rite it's not tender. It's not oh, we're going to set up this thing for you, but don't worry, you're going to make it through. It's it's a real question. Right. And I'm curious if you would speak to what does if you do make it through, what's the value of that for someone who makes it through a rite of passage where there really is a real life or death test?
What's the value for that? Well, you get to move forward on the life path. And in a healthy community context, the way I would describe it is you get to sit at the big kids table. And if you don't, in an intact, healthy cultural context, it's you can't stay at the little kids table. And so, yeah, just the ability to move forward in life and contribute to your community, to me, is a value. But the challenge is when you're operating within a cultural context, or we're operating within a cultural context, which actually says, our internal growth is something scary and something to be avoided at all costs, then the incentive to get to the big kids table, I think, becomes less.
Yeah, there's something too about that things get real, right? That if you face death, if you face not making it through things, there's a quality of the childish mind of just of being able to be with what is. Oh yeah, death is real. Death is, and it's I'm curious because I know that in my youth, all the people who I was growing up with, not all of them made it through. We created our own rites of passage. I don't think that it wasn't, as deliberate as putting language around it, but we definitely created rites of passage for ourselves and for each other. And, but it wasn't held by the community. Right. And it seems kind of well, either you can consciously do it, either a community can consciously set up these rites for our youth, right? And so that there is a container that they are held in moving through this and moving through the real challenge of coming into adulthood, or they're going to go through it anyway, but it's just not going to be held, right?
Right. And then if it's not held, then many young people, a far bigger proportion aren't going to make it through. And some of our
Right.
most
Yeah.
creative and most sensitive and connected souls are going to be the ones that we're going to lose, that we are losing.
Right. That we are definitely losing, right? Well, what happened? Why don't we have these in our culture right now?
Yeah, I think for me, this has been a particular area of exploration and of real passion and interest. I think in the world of rites of passage, we often talk about we lack these intentional rites of passage, and this is the consequence, and now we need to rebuild them. And a number of years ago, my colleague Sobi Wing offered this frame of, well, what happens specifically to, each of our ancestral rites of passage. And he kind of held the perspective that it may be that really understanding that history might be key to how we restore rites of passage in our communities. And so that set me really on a personal journey of trying to understand, what happened in my specific ancestral history, which is people that come from Ukraine and people that what's now called Ukraine, what's now called the British Isles. And what has become clear to me in my own ancestral story, and I think is true for many of us, is that, in the empire making efforts and which, became the forces of colonization and taking over land and seizing resources in the form of human lives and resources out of the ground and seizing land in places around the globe, that, over hundreds, thousands of years, methods of how do you destroy a culture really fast and get control of the people and the resources. That what became really clear is that the fastest way to destroy a culture is to take over the way that young people are educated and socialized. That's the way to destroy a culture in a single generation, is that you take over control, of how the young people are raised. And so that's my understanding of what's happened to rites of passage, is that, in many communities, they've either been, completely lost or outlawed, driven underground, as young people were, removed into boarding schools or forced into compulsory schooling that takes them out of the hands of the community. Or many of the ceremonies also were just kind of co-opted by Western consumerist culture. And now they become less about actually a significant passage on a life's phase level, and they become about opportunities to see the young person, but not in their own uniqueness, and really that holidays for gift exchange. So I don't want to denigrate ceremonies that continue to exist, but I will say that much of the heart of many ceremonies has been lost as they've mixed with Western consumerist culture, and the cultural elements have often been stripped away.
It makes me so curious about what would it look like, in your opinion, what would a really effective rite of passage welcoming in this culture, in the United States, in North America, what would a really effective rite of passage, or could it look like for someone? Not to be all monolithic about it and be oh, this is the only way, but just can you imagine, what are the elements that need to be present for something to really be that transformative rite of passage that welcomes someone into the community as an adult?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say there are many experiences that are out there exploring this, and there's a whole lot of things that I think are doing this. And so I want to just name this frame that for me actually really comes out of the literature of understanding white nationalism and radical extremism, that folks that kind of find their home within that and talk about a community with like practices of initiation, particularly for young men, and that the draw to extremism is identity, belonging, and a sense of purpose. And I think that is what's really needed by young people in the transition between childhood and adulthood and through adolescence. It's like, how do we, Elder Paul Hill, one of his quotes about rites of passage are that rites of passage are a cultural antihistamine to a socially toxic culture. And so it's like, how do we provide the antihistamine of identity, belonging, and a sense of purpose? And for me, and some of the most effective strategies that I see that are out there right now are ones that are really helping young people to claim their own unique individual identities, to understand their own ancestral history, not from a place of shame or guilt, but from a place of really understanding that true history, that are deeply connected with the lands that they're living on and the people of those lands and the history of the people of those lands, and ones that are providing opportunities for young people to connect really deeply with their bodies, with the natural world, to learn about the spiritual traditions of their families and also uncover their own spiritual beliefs and their own sense of the sacred, and are really helping them to identify what their unique gifts are that they can bring to the communities.
I'm curious about how you get the kids on board with this. Because like I know that with my kids, like I was like, they're going to have rites of passage. And they were like, oh, hell no. They were really resistant to it. We did it anyway. I forced them. But I don't know how effective that is, right? How do you get the buy-in of youth? I mean, I'm imagining, of course, some youth are like super into it, but like I'm imagining other people are like, oh, yeah, I don't need that. Like, and I see that so much with my teens where they're like, oh, I don't need that. I don't need to wear a seatbelt, or I don't need any support in my life, or I don't need to drink water. I don't need to eat, and as the adult, I'm saying, oh, actually, you actually do have needs. You do have these needs. You're creating your identity through rebellion, which is, of course, but like, how do you get the kids buy-in about it?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that many, programs that are out there grapple with. And so, some things that I feel like I've learned through my work with the Youth Passageways Network, which is this meeting ground of many different individuals, communities, organizations that are all engaged in initiatory work with young people, but in very different ways, is that one of the things that I've really seen is, first of all, that these issues of need, or how do you engage them, are particularly difficult, I would say, in like primarily white communities and primarily middle class communities. In other communities, the need for meaningful experiences, I think, is clearer, and they're often held within a social activism frame. And to me, that feels like a really key piece. Like when we look at like the level of activism of young people today, and the kind of like the strong stances around issues like the climate crisis, and I'm thinking of some of our partners in Los Angeles and like youth incarceration in Los Angeles County, and the work that's been done by young people to combat that. It's like, for me, the rites of passage, how this is supporting them in a path towards social engagement and activism, is one of the keys to the whole thing. And it's, I think it's also about engaging young people in the design of the initiations. Really, the more that things are held within an intergenerational initiation as context, as opposed to like, we're going to do this thing for you that's kind of focused all on you. But it's like, how do we actually all within a community context support each person to move to their next life stage?
So maybe not forcing them. Maybe that was not such a great move on my part as a
I
parent.
mean, I don't know. This is a tricky thing, right? Because I think there is something about saying, like, I think it's about options too. Like, look, this is really important to you. And ideally, young people are seeing older young people, like children are seeing teens in either, their families or their immediate communities going through something. And so it sort of gets planted in their brain early on. You're going to do this. I have good friends in Corvallis where for their children, it was never a question. They were told from the time they were 4 or 5 years old, like, when you're this age, you'll go do this experience. And so that frame was just always clear for them. So that's one thing, is just building it into the lexicon, far before there's the need to, individuate.
Differentiate.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think also this question of, there's many different types of offerings out there, and some will appeal to some young people and others to other young people, and how to really meet them where they're at with their specific interests. Do you want to go be in nature for 2 weeks, or do you want to go dance for 2 weeks? So it's not just one form of what a rite of passage looks like that they have access.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'm just wondering what you would say. So you go through the rite of passage, and then you are an adult. And what does that mean? What does it mean to be an adult?
Yeah, I think this is, for me, one of the kind of critical questions that we need to agree on as a society. That right now, like I mean, I have conversations with young people, and I would say young adults, like folks that are technically adults, maybe are in their mid 20s or even older, about like really claiming adulthood for themselves. And what have they ever, been initiated into adulthood? Have they ever claimed that? And one of the things I really frequently hear is like, adulthood seems awful. It's a lot of drudgery and work and self-sacrifice and burnout. And why on earth would they want that? And so I think I personally feel that we really need to have a kind of reckoning conversation as a society about the fact that we can't glorify youth and denigrate adulthood, elderhood as being over the hill, or folks aren't really going to step into adulthood. And the way that I would define adulthood is that your focus is that your priority is on the community and the good of the whole, as that you have a sense of your gifts, that you're able to bring them to service in the community, and that is kind of more important than immediate gratification or your own desires. And not to say that adulthood needs to be self-sacrificing, or that folks need to work themselves to the bone. That part of how we can show up for the community is that we care for ourselves, but that Bill Plotkin talks about where is our center of gravity, and that our center of gravity is on the community, and not on our own individual self-interest.
Yeah, that's really helpful. When I hear that, what I would add to that is like responsibility. Like, and I know this is like a controversial thing, and it's a hard sell for me, and I say it frequently, but like responsibility for our own trauma, right? Of like the ways that our trauma impacts our community, impacts others. And I'm just curious if it's a hard sell because it's unfair, right? That we have to somehow step into ownership of like, everything that happened to me. And if that's causing me to act in ways that are against my community, right? Or doing harm in community. Like I actually have to clean that up, even though it might not have been me who had installed that, right? Like that might have come from others. And I just wonder if you have anything that you want to share about that in terms of adulthood and trauma.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's right on. And, like, as I said to you at the beginning, like, I'm having like some challenges in my own life. And I would name that some of them have to do with like uncovering some trauma that I really need to own and take responsibility for as an adult. Right. And that's ongoing work. Again, I take some solace in Bill Plotkin's work around what he calls soul-centric human development. And how he says, we may be in a certain life stage, but that, given the cultural conditions that we live in and just the truth of us as humans, we still have cleanup work to do from the previous life stages. But the more, that I can like fully live in that adult quadrant of life, means, yeah, exactly what you're talking about, of really taking responsibility for my own trauma and being able to show up for the community and being able to name my limits and boundaries, and that I can't do that perfectly all the time.
Right. And I think it also means not just trauma, but like also like your gifts, like stepping fully into your gifts, right, is also part of adulthood, of kind of getting out of that perpetual question of like, oh my gosh, what's my purpose? What am I supposed to do? And the kind of the flopping around about that, and just really doing that deep work of like, okay, what are my gifts and how am I going to spend this life bringing them through for the sake of goodness, for the sake of a good life, for the sake of my people who came before and after and the communities that I live in, right? Of like, how am I going to do that? And I wonder if you'd be open to talking about some of the edges that you're facing in your own work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for me, this is a juicy topic. And at some point, I would love to hear about the edges in your work as well. I mean, I think
Sure.
I see the work of restoring rites of passage in our culture as part of a larger effort to really explore, the edges of what's needed in our world today, and like go to places that we haven't gone as a culture and a society, which both means, returning to ancient ways, but also, what are the emergent practices and what is really relevant today with the specific issues that we face today. I think, one of the edges of my work is, it's always going deeper with my social identities, in particular as a white, cisgendered woman, settler, middle class, living on the lands of the Metau people in North Central Washington. How do I really take responsibility for the privileges that I am lucky enough to have inherited, and the hard work of my ancestors to get me to a moment that I could have access to rites of passage. Like, how do I make sense of all of that and use the agency I have in my life is key question. I really see the work of coming together across differences in the context of, structural inequality is really key to rites of passage today, and really key to the cultural practices that are needed. Is like, how do we really learn to listen to each other? And so, how to show up in that is one question. How to be with money, and the frame of capitalism in the work of rites of passage, I would say, is an edge for me, but it's also an edge for many of the partners of youth passageways, of recognizing the need to make a living under capitalism, but also that these are cultural ceremonies. And what does it mean when we charge for them? And how do we also ensure access for all young people? And then the last thing I would really name is like, what does this really look like on the most immediate level? In my family, one of the things that is true for me is that I've been, engaged in rites of passage, but I haven't actually really shown up very well for my brother's children and their process of initiation into adulthood. And how do I show up for my friends who have teenagers with some of the issues that you named of like, yeah, young people are not all into this. And for me, like, what I want to give them is also not necessarily a rite of passage that they might get, from a program, but what they would get from me embedded in my community. And how do I make that happen? Yeah, that's an edge for me as well.
Yeah, thanks for the honest sharing about that. It's appreciated, right? I just think that value of like appearing perfect, right? Of like appearing like we've got it all together, it's so bullshit. And to like really honestly share about like, oh yeah, this is what's hard about this. Like I'm so in this work and like these are really hard things that I'm wrestling with. I also wrestle with the money question about like, how to make a living and how to make sure that folks have access to my work. This podcast is one way I do that, and it's a big one. And I know I wanted to say this other thing about being adult, which is which is recognizing your projections on people, like recognizing when you're projecting your stuff on people and like pulling it back, right? I think that's anyway, when I think about like talking about money and community, I think about that happens a lot, right? And how do we be a little bit more grown up about it sometimes? Yeah. Darcy, I want to just ask you about the Fire Fellowship and if you'd talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the Fire Fellowship is a new offering. It's a collaboration between Youth Passageways and the Ojai Foundation. The Ojai Foundation was one of the original partners of Youth Passageways, and they were deeply affected by the Thomas Fire, which was at the time in 2017 the biggest fire in California state history, and lost many buildings on their lands, were very affected, have been in closed to the public and in recovery for the last 2 years. And one of the things that they really realized in the response to the fire was how fundamental the kind of practices of the foundation and of of rites of passage, frankly, in these times, as well as council practice, which is deeply informs the Ojai Foundation. That those were key to their resilience. And so we've come together to offer this fellowship for emerging young leaders, 18 to 30. This year, it's really focused on, for this first cohort, the Central and Southern California region, but bringing together, a diverse group of young leaders in that area to be really deep in FIRE. Foundations in Resilience Education is what FIRE stands for. So really being with fire as a alchemical force in our world, and then also what are the practices that we can engage in together to build individual and community resilience in these times of climate crisis. So the application window is currently open, and it closes on December 21st. And then the Fire Fellowship will begin in April.
Wonderful. In having this conversation with you, I'm noticing in me a longing for, I'm like, I'm an adult and I want a rite of passage. And I just wanting to invite you to talk a little bit about that, because I know I think you have an upcoming series for adults. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do have an upcoming series for adults, and it's really, it is for adults that are like feel the call to the path of rites of passage and bringing them to young people. That's the frame that I work within, is that I'm really most invested in working with adults that are, on that path to how can they bring these practices to their communities, but also recognizing, as been so clear in our conversation, that includes doing some of our own adolescent cleanup work, and at least knowing the terrain that's there so that we can engage in that, not, with young people that we're working with, but in other containers. So yeah, beginning in January, there's a 3-part leadership series that's again offered as a partnership between Youth Passageways and this time a program out of Washington State called Rite of Passage Journeys. And there's more information on the Rite of Passage Journeys website about that offering.
Yeah, it's riteofpassagejourneys.org. And then the other was ohifoundation.org, just so folks have access to those. Great. And your website is youthpassageways.org, and folks can visit you there for more information. And I just want to say thank you so much. Thanks for coming on Bespoken Bones, but also just, it's really good that there are people who are tending this great need and who can step back and see oh, here is a crack in the cultural foundation of, this is partly how we've got to where we are. Right. And so there's a corrective here. This is the corrective. Let's do it. Right. And so I just want to also just have a lot of gratitude, for your work in the world, and, all my love and all my support towards that flourishing and prospering and touching millions of lives.
Thank you. And just to really, again, give honor to my teachers, for me, it's very clear that I was lucky enough to, stumble my way into something when I was 13. And it's very clear to me that, that was a gift that I need to give back. So really to honor the elders and mentors and ancestors that have that continue to support my work.
Yeah, thank you for being here on Bespoken Bones. And thanks, folks, for listening to this episode. And if you felt inspired by what you heard, definitely check out youthpassageways.org. And if you want to know more about what I'm up to right now, I'm doing a really cool thing. I am starting an online school for sex, intimacy, and relationship information, education. It's called Wellcelium, creating a learning community of erotic wellness that encircles the globe, that really carries this connection of the earth of our bodies and the sexuality of our own bodies to a greater body. So check that out at wellcelium.org, WELLCELIUM.org, or at Wellcelium on Instagram. And I'm Pavini, and I will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.